And now for the main event coming up here, we've got Steve Wood with us tonight to talk about the emerging AI regulatory landscape and what technology practitioners need to know. I will not even attempt to summarize your bio, but suffice it to say that when I learned that Steve was a space lawyer, I was pretty excited about getting him on the schedule for PyData Pittsburgh and the other meetup groups here tonight. And I know you've worked for a long time at the intersection of technology and the law, and that's what we'll hear about tonight.
Cheers.
All right, and I'll leave it up to you.
Thanks, Patrick. Cheers. Yeah, thanks everyone for your interest in this topic. So, I guess I'll start with a caveat. Gary and I got connected by a mutual space attorney friend, Bailey Reichelt with Aegis Space Law, and I have been working with part-time with my brother's law firm, Bella Wood, out of Austin and Dallas, Texas. My career background is in academic tech transfer, most recently with State University of New York, central office tech transfer office, serving like close to 30 campuses in that system. But since then, in my transition out of that role, I became embedded with an AFRL-funded research group at SUNY Albany that does neuromorphic computing research or advanced AI hardware. And so I've been kind of on the hardware side of AI a little bit, even considering doing a startup around that. Things didn't gel quite the way they needed to, but we'll see. I think, especially for space, neuromorphic has a lot of promise because some of the components are inherently rad hard, and for beyond Van Allen belt, beyond Earth orbit, we're going to need rad hard computational platforms. My background, and let's see, let me get over to my slide deck and start that up for us. And so my background, my undergrad's in geology, was kind of between physics and geo for me. I kind of got it handed to me in the maths, and so went geology, but ultimately went back, did a dual degree, master's electrical engineering and the law at Syracuse University, where I kind of fell into patent law. And what really grabbed me was the fact that I had to learn new tech in science for each new client. And so that's why I really gravitated to this career field. Always been interested in all things space ever since I was a kid. And so when the opportunity came around, I went back, got my Master of Law in Air and Space Law, and kind of really honed in on the intersection with patents in space and how patents work differently in space. There's a whole case here about it, Hughes Aircraft Co. versus US. I know they sued the government a bunch of times, but the one that was decided in '93 by Court of Federal Claims really kind of shows that patents work differently for space. Anyhow, that's a bit on my background, all by way of saying I'm a bit of a nubile to AI regulation. Thanks to Gary. I thought this would be a great opportunity to get up to speed on a quickly evolving field of law and regulation that I wasn't super familiar with, but probably should be given my own activities kind of in the AI space. And so I will do my best, the caveat, I will do my best not to read from the slides to you, but I really view this slide deck as a compilation of, kind of a succinct summary of the regulations, various regulations and legal regimes out there currently, and I'll plan to make this available via PyData, Code and Supply, et cetera, to anyone who's attended afterwards. So that can be a resource for you as well, and certainly feel free to follow up with me with any questions. Without further ado, we'll kind of get into it, starting with fair use disclaimer, et cetera, legal disclaimer, there's no attorney-client relationship, et cetera. I play an attorney on TV sometimes. No, actually, I'm a real attorney. Recent calls. All of these luminaries and well-known companies have called for regulation. We saw from 22 to 23, 185% increase, so almost 2x in terms of the amount of lobbying conducted by organizations to help influence the AI regulatory landscape. Sam Altman is, notoriously claimed for, licensing essentially of companies doing AI research. So many companies, again, have kind of gotten into this lobbying game, trying to affect the regulatory landscape. Various international trends. The UN is on all about it. China's in the lead. They took a quick early lead, and they just had some new regulations with respect to AI chatbots come online last year. UK seeking to play a pivotal role. France, Italy, and Japan. I think folks may have seen the news on Italy when they banned ChatGPT, at least for a while, when it was first deployed. And EU has their AI Act. This will be the only place that I really cover this, but this is an important topic. The fact that there are international standards out there, the EU and US collaborate on developing these international standards. Many others as well, but the very concerted collaboration between these two. And that's really important because once standards are put into place, like MP3, Blue, all these various standards, they kind of tend to affect the trajectory, the overall trajectory for technological development. And then you wind up with standards essential patents that are essentially required to be licensed among the parties that create the standards, and then also folks who want to develop within the standard. And it has to be fair, reasonable, et cetera. Because these folks have participated in developing the standard, they're not able to then really leverage their IP to extract those typical monopoly prices. When you're in a standard working group, you have to make some concessions. But real quickly on the EU AI, and if anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to raise your hand and interrupt. Happy to have be a bit more of an engaging dialogue. EU Act was recently approved by European Union Parliament. Folks probably very familiar with their GDPR and how they've really kind of staked a claim as one of the more let's say conservative regimes when it comes to data privacy. And they're looking to set similar standards in the AI field. So they actually categorize automated systems based on risk. They regulate them based on this risk. So stuff like facial recognition that's deemed as more high risk will get more regulation than chatbots. It remains to be seen how that will all play out. Maybe the chatbots will be really dangerous. I don't know. It also outright bans some systems that they deem as unacceptable, biometric surveillance, et cetera. So EU has taken a fairly progressive stand in the field. Turning to the US, we have a very smattering of different endeavors. We don't have any congressionally legislated hard law as of yet. We have a few executive orders. The first two here were during President Trump's rule as president. And then President Biden just recently, towards the end of last year, had the most recent executive order in this space. Again, they've really tended to establish principles, priorities, and some guidelines. You'll see as we go through, I've started a couple of slides that really do impact private companies and researchers, developers in AI. And so I'll make those really clear. But for the most part, it's a lot of aspirational and a lot of government facing regulations, telling the agencies how they need to go about implementing, developing, deploying AI, et cetera. So we'll get into this a little bit more. And there's some other, I'm tackling the executive orders in the chronological order, and I've also put in some of the other regulatory efforts alongside. So you'll see this is the first executive order from President Trump and his regime. And so we have, again, wanting, the aspirations to maintain USAI leadership, and the establishment of 5 principles. And it really comes down to driving technological breakthroughs, developing technical standards, again, to the point I was making earlier, training the workforce, fostering public trust by protecting liberties and privacy, and opening markets to US companies and AI commercial efforts. Oop, wrong way. Here we go. Do this. Okay, yep. And so it also includes the 6 strategic objectives, which is really to promote AI R&D. Again, along with the 5 principles, these strategic objectives are recapitulating, but maybe a little bit more directed. They want to enhance access to high quality data and models, reduce barriers to use, promote innovative development within AI, and again, kind of champion the US leading role. So ensuring technical standards minimize these vulnerabilities to malicious actors is really important. Again, training researchers. This is more along the lines of workforce development with the 5 principles. And again, these are specific actions to be taken, skills programs, STEM education, et cetera. They also comes with a requirement to develop an action plan to protect the U.S. advantage. And this is where I mentioned the National Security Presidential Memo. When I went digging for all of this in the National Archives, you can find a bunch of other National Security Presidential Memos. This one, along with some others, does not have a hyperlink through, and that just makes me curious. So I can't tell you, any more about what in accordance with that memo specifically means. So this actually came with enhancement to agency budgets, this executive order, and giving access to computing resources, dedicating computing resources to some of these efforts. Also the requirement to establish inventories of AI products and services used, and to be transparent about those. In 2020, became effective law January 2021, was the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative. It created this specific office that you see here, the emblem, the logo. It also came with mandates for NSF, amongst others. Government Accounting Office has to study and figure out what will be required to maintain our lead. NSF is going to fund a bunch of research and education, establish programs, etc. OSTP, Office of Science and Technology, that's in here somewhere, the acronym. And they established this office. Here are a few of the other mandates: that NIST will develop voluntary standards. NSTC shall establish this interagency committee to coordinate federal programs, and Department of Energy is pulled in here. Folks are probably aware, DOE has many of our supercomputing facilities, and so they're very instrumental to all of these efforts as well. And again, NSF and National Research Council from the national academies need to study AI and workforce. This is the second executive order under President Trump, and promoting use of trustworthy AI by government. Again, this one is really directed towards telling the agencies what they need to do in implementing AI. It starts off with these following principles: respect the American values, Constitution, other laws, assess and manage risks. It requires that accurate, reliable, effective, safe, reliable. We're trying to, de-risk AI to the greatest extent possible, it seems like, with these programs. But it's still so nascent that it seems to me that that's a really challenging endeavor, without also hamstringing some of our potential innovations. So I won't read all of these. You'll receive these slides. But again, it establishes these principles and then goes on. It has this information sharing requirement, and that is with respect to all of the agencies except DoD and the intelligence community. So other than those two, the Federal Chief Innovation Officer Council should identify, provide guidance, and make publicly available criteria, et cetera, regarding non-sensitive AI and non-classified AI applications. So even if they're not DoD or IC, if they have a sensitive or classified application, it might not wind up in the inventory. But again, this is going to affect procurement, information that the agency contractors have to provide the agencies about the applications that are being developed or deployed on their behalfs. How agencies will test and audit government contracts where performance relies either on AI or has AI as a deliverable. In there as well, we have this Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House dropped their blueprint for AI Bill of Rights in October of 22. And they really are pitching this as a handbook for folks who want to be proactive with AI, to give them guidelines on how to best implement and deploy AI. And so they've included, feedback from lots of stakeholders, as you can see there, and they're really seeking to make AI as transparent, as minimally discriminatory and as safe to use as possible. Maintaining all of the legal requirements of our current civil rights regimes, healthcare, etc. Some more on the blueprint. Again, another kind of recapitulation of principles: safe and effective. They want to avoid algorithmic discrimination, ensure data privacy, provide that transparency, notice and explanations. If you are going to be impacted by an automated decision, there's a real sense that you should at least be aware that it was an automated decision, and maybe at that point, due process might come into play or something. You might have some recourse that you could take. We were just talking earlier about was it one of the chatbots that had misquoted policy? So yeah, absolutely. These are important considerations. And also human alternatives, which I found rather reassuring, but also curious how that will actually be effectively implemented to have a right to a human alternative. So we'll see how that goes. NIST also got involved January of 23 with their AI risk management framework. And this was directed to them by that National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act. And so they have actually stood up this Trustworthy and Responsible AI Resource Center. You've got the link right here. And so if you want to get some assistance from NIST, effectively in terms of guidance, et cetera, they've got kind of my understanding is it's a bit of a portal or a wizard that can kind of walk you through different aspects of these concerns and considerations that for implementing risk management in organizations that are using and deploying AI. All right, now to President Biden's recent executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development of AI. It's guided by 8 priorities, and so it must be safe and secure, robust, reliable, repeatable. Again, I won't read all of these to you, but again, responsibility while maintaining our lead in the technology development space here. And commitment to workers, workforce development, equity and civil rights, interest of Americans who increasingly use should be protected, and again, privacy, civil liberties, and management of risks from the government use of AI within its internal regulatory regimes. Let's see. The specific definition of AI is used here, though, which makes this executive order potentially a little bit more broad in that the definition includes really any machine-based system that makes predictions, recommendations, or decisions on real or virtual environments. So this is really kind of any machine-based system that does these things. It doesn't have to be like a standard neural network or something that is conventionally thought of as AI. As long as it is a machine-based system that does these things, I don't know what the Antikythera mechanism or some of the, I wonder, that it's a machine, even though it's mechanical, but it makes predictions on location of planetary objects, apparently is their best guess as to what that thing does. But we've got physical computers out there as well. And so I wonder how far this could potentially be extended again, just for level setting. Executive orders aren't really legally binding in the way that law is on us. So they're binding on the agencies, the executive branch agencies, and they can certainly set their requirements with respect to how they interface with companies who are doing business with those agencies. They can even say, and as you'll see, if you're exceeding certain thresholds, you need to talk to us. But with respect to like legislated law, it doesn't hold quite the same weight. So here we're getting to some of the important stuff for private companies. President Biden's executive order, it was further up above, came with 150 concrete actions addressing, I forget what the statistic was. It was quite a few agencies, and most of the deadlines were within 90 days. Some of them throughout the subsequent year. So in January of this year, President Biden, the White House announced completion of all the 90-day tasks that were set. And so this is another portion of that executive order where Department of Commerce has to define technical criteria for AI models and resources that must be reported. Here we go. And they must require companies developing dual-use AI to report to the government. So, this is part of Department of Commerce's obligations under this. They have to do these things. So they have to require these companies that are developing these technologies to do this reporting, and then as well for companies that happen to acquire, develop, or possess large computing infrastructure to report on the computing power. So if you're building a supercomputer, yes, sir. Dual use is when there is both a commercial and potentially a military or intelligence use. Yep. And this executive order relies on Defense Production Act to require these agencies to comport with this executive order. Again, so Department of Commerce has to define these technical criteria. And again, we've got the threshold here of 10 to the 26 floating point operations per second, right? So that was characterized as more than any trained model yet to date, except that GPT-4 was kind of just under this threshold. So you can imagine if GPT-4 is just under this threshold, we're going to be exceeding this threshold very, very quickly. Here are a couple of the references with respect to the researchers' estimations. We also have Office of Management and Budget has issued a couple of memos in accordance with some of the executive orders here. So the first memo by OMB was in accordance and coordinated with President Trump's first executive order on AI, and then we've got a more recent memo from just a few weeks ago that is coordinated with President Biden's executive order. These, again, are really directed towards the government and providing requirements for them. So with the states, because the federal government has not really provided hard legislation here, states are moving in. There's in the legal field, there's this idea of federal preemption. So if the federal government says the drinking age is 21, they're the ones who get to set the drinking age. States can't really regulate that, and then of course the government holds the the interstate highway funds, ransom if you don't comport with their drinking age requirements. This happens in many different fields. When the federal government legislates, it's said that the states are preempted, but we're seeing a lot more conflict these days along those lines vis-a-vis immigration, what have you. So as of July last year, almost 300 AI-related measures had been introduced in 36 plus states. Over 30 states enacted approximately 50 state laws. These tend to have been directed towards AI in elections, algorithmic discrimination, automated decision tools, especially when those are used for employment decisions. Again, this kind of concept of an AI Bill of Rights for the consumers who use and interact with AI, and then a lot of working group bills where they're establishing councils and commissions to look into the potential implications of AI and make recommendations for future regulation. We've got some additional topics that are important here. I'll go into some depth in the export controls. White House has, in conjunction with their other efforts, sought a lot of these voluntary commitments from leading companies. There are patentability considerations to be had here. In addition, there's the whole copyright issue. I don't go into this in any greater depth here. If folks would like to learn more about that, I'd be happy to engage. But there are significant questions about the training data that have been used for these models and whether the purveyors of these models have violated copyrights of others like New York Times, et cetera, simply by scraping the internet for the training data. And last but not least, there's clearly no unified single regime here, and it's very currently agency specific, and we'll get into some of the more hardline requirements now around export control, which is a big concern because there are very stiff criminal penalties at play for violations of export control laws. So Bureau of Industry and Standards is BIS, I believe. So, and again, that acronym should be further up. So let's see. We've got in 2020 BIS adding new regional stability export control, which means that it needs a license for export to any country except to Canada, hence the regional stability. And the only license exception is currently available to U.S. government, and this is really, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe yes. So it's got to be a neural network that automates analysis of geospatial imagery. So this is the one real kind of AI software export control regulation in place. To me, it seems fairly narrow in terms of it's really geospatial oriented, et cetera. It has to provide a GUI that enables users to identify objects, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as it meets all of these technical criteria, then it winds up being covered by the export control regulation, and you would need a license to export it. Hardware has been a little bit more active with export control regulations, CHIPS Act, semiconductor concerns, et cetera. So in October 2022, BIS added new export controls on several of their export control classification numbers, as you can see here. And so this is really around integrated circuits and computer chips. So again, also for software and technologies used in the manufacture of those chips, and also end use control. So what these resources, what purpose they would ultimately be put to at their end use destination. And so it provides performance thresholds that all companies will have to abide by. And here are those performance thresholds for the integrated circuit. So, you know, bidirectional transfer rates of such and such, 4,100 trillion operations per second. And then when it comes to analog, it looks like it's quite a bit more in terms of the number of operations per second for the threshold. So analog computing is somewhat related to the neuromorphic that I mentioned earlier. And so we're coming up with hardware right now that essentially can do analog computations, as folks may be well aware. And so this ECCN here controls computers that contain these chips. Again, there's the ECN for the chips themselves. And we've got a special one for computers that include those chips. When it comes to specific hardware, the thresholds are, you know, almost on par with the NVIDIA A100, and I just added some specs here for, you know, easy reference. And this is very much to do, again, with competition with China and maintaining U.S. economic and technological advantage. And so to compete in China, many of our companies have released these nerfed versions of their hardware, but it winds up, you know, compromised with respect to what we're able to get, but it still may be of interest in the Chinese markets because we're putting these export controls in place that are making it harder for them to get the super high-end stuff that we don't let out of the country. And so although they are working towards building their own internal capabilities for integrated semiconductor manufacturing, they're not quite there yet. And so the US has really turned to focus on the hardware end of things, because without the chips themselves, it winds up being very difficult to build and execute these larger models. In the end, with export control, we also have the catch-all provisions, and these, again, are really oriented towards end use. So we also have certain categories up here, like this neural computers, that can be rather broad and kind of catch-all provisions from the hardware side, but also we have the end use. So if you're going to be putting this to, you know, some foreign military application, foreign intelligence application, et cetera, and you have knowledge of that, that's going to be a big no-no under export control and can get you in a whole heap of trouble. Huge fines, big jail time, not fun. All right. Yeah, all about the end use, and also there are certain limitations here, right? So U.S. export control laws won't apply to foreign technology developed by a foreign person unless that technology is imported to the U.S., in which point we may exercise some controls over re-export, et cetera. So just because if you get some high-end AI from a foreign source, don't automatically presume that you can, share with another foreign national, because that could wind up being a deemed export. Even here within the U.S. territories, if a U.S. citizen shares an export-controlled technology with a person who's here in the U.S., that can be a deemed export if that person is a foreign national. A green card gets you around that problem. So if the person is a green card holder, they're treated as a U.S. citizen effectively with respect to export controls. If we're talking about classified work, that's a whole different story. Yes, sir.
So if you're building it out in the cloud, is it by the data center you pick? So let's say you're using Amazon.
No, 100, absolutely. For export controls, we're always very concerned about where the data is stored. And so if you're a U.S. citizen, you're going to be subject to U.S. laws wherever you are. So it doesn't matter if you're, say, doing that development, in Uruguay, saving to a server in Australia. If, the development and or the data is done in a foreign location, as a U.S. citizen, you might wind up subject to penalty under these laws. Yeah.
Even green card holders?
So green card holders are eligible to receive ITAR controlled information. That's not a problem from a deemed export. If that green card holder then transfers, they could be the one who winds up penalized. Yes, it's not, if a green card holder receives export controlled tech, they also need to be very careful about sharing with anyone from the home country or any other foreign national, just the same as U.S. citizen. Yes, sir.
But if they lose their green card, are they supposed to revoke that? How does that work at that point?
Oh, are you talking about a person who has held a green card and no longer?
Yeah, and no longer, maybe it's like a work visa green card.
Sure. So the visa doesn't get you there. The work visa doesn't get you there with respect to, that would still be a deemed export. So yeah, this is a little bit of a rabbit hole I've had to go down as well. I mentioned earlier kind of having some startup aspirations around the neuromorphic. One of our cohort at SUNY Albany, Indian National, this is the person in the world who builds these development boards that interface with this very specialized Air Force chip. Now, that's totally fine on the academic side, fundamental research exemption under export control. I've got some software and encryption export control slides as an addendum, and there is some stuff in there about fundamental research. And anyone can engage in fundamental research, if you're at a university, it's very clear. If you're working with a nonprofit or something like that, you could also be doing fundamental research, but you need to be really careful about how you handle the technical data. If it's export controlled, there is a requirement to actually publish it so that it as open source, because then it's considered fundamental research. And you can't have firewalls. You can't be tracking where it's going. So there's some interesting considerations that need to be kept in play, in addition to the fact that you must release it, but you also have to share a copy with the government first. Because if you release before sharing with them, that could be considered an export, even if it's open source. So let's see. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do I have to have a relationship with the government so that I can share it with them, or do I just email that to them and say, here you have it?
That's a great question. If you have that concern, I'd be happy to help you figure that out. But it would be going through either, I believe it's Department of State on ITAR and Department of Commerce on EAR with respect to getting a license. And so they would also likely be the ones to, and it might be the kind of thing where as long as you give them and again, I'm shooting from the hip, speaking out of turn. The way it was, I worked at Brookhaven National Lab for a while, Department of Energy. We did open source software distributions, and the way it was with them, the way it had been, so you had to wait for them to give you the okay, and the developers hated it, and it didn't work, and it was horrible. So they ultimately moved to, if you want to distribute open source, you make a submission, and if we don't tell you no within 6 weeks, then you're free. So it might be something similar along those lines, where as long as you give them a copy, and then if they don't get back, it might be something like that, but I didn't delve into the specific ways to go about it, just covering the fact that it's regulated that you must. Cheers. Yes, sir.
So in terms of sharing the artifacts, I mean, what can and can you not share? Is it the code, hardware, architecture, the data, or just everything? When would you know that you're doing this?
So with respect to AI, again, the real export control concerns here are all around the hardware. We've got the one piece of software with geospatial, and I'll just get back to this. Into my extended. So yes, before dual use, so this is really with respect to encryption and open source encryption. So when it comes to export controlled encryption, you're going to need to provide a copy. So not AI itself, but I've included as an addendum here the export controls on software and encryption because they're so adjacent and closely related. And I can certainly see AI having a very important role in executing encryption protocols. And so wanted to include that just for folks, additional edification on this, but it doesn't relate specifically to AI models. Is that
Good, yeah.
satisfactory?
Sure.
Great. So this is some of the rationale for why we do the export controls. We are evaluated to have a good lead on the hardware, and so that seems like part of the real good rationale for why we're focusing our export control efforts there rather than on the models themselves, which tend to proliferate open source on the internet. And so if we can limit the hardware, that seems to be a more effective bottleneck potentially. And let's see, yes, again, the ability to make and use these models is really diminished without access to the specialized hardware. So I think we're good here. With respect to patents, AI is amenable to patent as software. So as long as you can get a software patent on this system, you can patent AIs. But what's becoming really interesting for USPTO is that AI is now also contributing to inventions. And there was recently a case where a kind of an AI activist filed a patent application that listed only the AI system as the inventor, no human inventor. And that was denied. And they will not issue patents for non-human inventors. Under the U.S. Federal law, the listed inventors must be humans. And so, we can't... I believe what their position is that they're interested and they want to hear when AI has been used, but they don't want it listed as an inventor. And they also provide very specific guidance. So they feel like their existing protocols are really sufficient with respect to the fact that the inventor needs to be human, and they felt like they only really needed to clarify that human contribution needs to be the patentable part. So the AI can have made patentable contributions as well, those novel, unique contributions to the claims of a patent. But you also must have a patentable human contribution in the claims. So as long as you have that, modicum of human contribution, you'll be all right to get a patent issued in this in this field of AI, and or in any field, honestly, because AI is now right. Proliferating components. These are all the different kinds of components, shapes and sizes and materials that could be used. And so even outside the field of AI, where AI is contributing and assisting in inventions, there's a potential, it's usually called subject matter eligibility there with respect to whether content is allowed to be patented. So again, USPTO also provides some good resources. They provide some hypotheticals for inventors working with AIs and how those would be dealt with and handled with by the patent examiners. That's both for the patent examiners themselves in evaluating patent applications, but also for the general public. So absolutely, if you're working with AI to create and make innovations, I would say this is going to be a really great resource for you. Again, and USPTO is working with other agencies, et cetera, on all different types of IP. And they will be issuing, I'm not sure if I got it in here, but they have also said that they will be issuing further guidance as things progress. Yes, sir.
I have the impression that right now a lot of companies, they don't use AI in any invention process also, at least the ones that I know.
Okay.
Because I'm wondering, when it comes to dispute, who will speak for the AI?
How do you mean when it comes to dispute?
I guess when there is a dispute in front of a patent court or something.
Right, with respect to who would speak to the rationale behind the invention. Fair. Fair.
Is this something that the organization is trying to work out, or so is this a problem for them?
No, because what they have said really is that their existing framework for human inventorship is sufficient, and they just wanted to clarify that you should not list the AI as a sole inventor. They don't want it listed as a co-inventor either, they wanted to clarify that inventions made with the assistance of AI are patentable, because their law basically says non-human inventions are not patentable.
So in rephrasing this, it basically means that the people who are on the patent, they have to speak for the AI, or the reasoning behind it.
Certainly. The folks who train the model to do whatever it is that it does, or
yeah, I was thinking if someone said, "Oh, ChatGPT, what is a good reason for doing this, or how to do that," and then put that in a patent or something.
Yeah, I've tried to. It's interesting when it comes to generative AI, because they're really good at recapitulating stuff that's already known, and so to get large language models to kind of think outside the box is maybe a little challenging. So yeah. Yes, sir.
But isn't that also the point of the patent office? Because a patent, I forget what they're called, but the person in the patent office does go over previous patents and make sure.
Yes, the patent examiner.
So like in that example, if it was in something else, it'd probably get knocked down by the patent office because it's too similar or something like that.
Yes, absolutely. The fundamental criteria are still going to apply, so it must be useful. That's a throwaway criteria. We don't even consider it. It has to be novel. That means the examiner is not able to find each and every element of the claim in your patent application in a single prior art reference. Another patent application, a journal article, a conference proceeding, poster, what have you. If they can find all of the elements in a single reference, they give you a novelty or an anticipation rejection. If they're not able to, they can cobble multiple references together and argue that it would have been obvious to a person of ordinary skill in the art. That's our big legal fiction in patent law. What is that person? What's their skill level? It would have to have been obvious to that person at the time the application was filed to attempt to combine those multiple references, having all of the elements together. And if the examiners will often stretch that real far, and it's the patent attorney and the inventor job to kind of bring them back down to earth and say, no, that component doesn't actually do what you said it does. You know, and this is why we're actually novel and unique and not obvious over the prior art. Yes, sir. I'll get to you next, sir.
Is the burden of proof on the prior art, is that on the examiner or on the applicant? Because I can see an argument where if a model generates some paragraph or some blueprints that is used for an invention, but it's trained on training data, which is prior art.
Sure. So one thing to understand is that there's no copyright in patents and patent applications. So if you want to plagiarize anyone and everyone, you can do that in the patent world. you can refer to other people's work, incorporate by reference in entirety, etc. Again, your concern though is around.
Is it? I guess you have to assume that the AI can make something novel. Right.
Indeed, and there are
on training data.
There are specialized AI systems, right, where you can say create the lighting for this space, or create a bunch of different components that might fit into this, a technical specification configuration. So there are systems out there that can kind of innovate to some extent, and when they do, that's fine. You can include that in the patent claims, but you must also have a patentable human contribution. If the invention is made entirely by the AI, you're going to have to come up with a human contribution to get it through. Is that great? Yes, sir.
Thinking about that human contribution part, there has to be like a little bit, like a seed from a human or something like that to create whatever the invention is. What if there's an adversary for some invention that uses AI to come up with a final product who decides to basically have a different initial human contribution that says, well, even though this is effectively the same product, because the human contribution at the beginning is different, and we don't know what the AI did, this is a different thing. Does the office have something for that sort of like patent workaround that could potentially happen?
So I think that's really going to. There used to be, before the patent office, proceedings known as interference proceedings. And those could be instigated essentially by going to your competitor's patent, grabbing their claims, and throwing their claims almost word verbatim into your patent application that might have a different description. And when that would be realized at the patent office that there were very similar claims out there in another application, they would stop prosecution on both, and there would be an interference proceeding to figure out who had the real priority. And so that was often a business strategy. These days, that proceeding has been done away with since America Invents Act in 2013, so over a decade now, no more interference proceedings. Really all we have to worry about now is whether there is infringement between a product and a patent. And so if we've made an AI model that we've collaborated with to create an invention, call it ABC, and someone else, another team, creates a different AI model, but they use it to do basically the same thing, and there could be a couple versions there. Maybe their invention is ABD, or maybe it's ABCDEFG, right? And so if their new invention is ABCDEFG, that includes all of the elements ABC of our claim, our invention, and so it just adds things as improvements. And so our patent, as granted, would be enforceable against their product in the market. If they would certainly be entitled to their new patent application on those additional new elements. But if they tried to claim just ABC, our patent would provide prior art in terms of patentability. They would be denied a claim on just ABC because we've already got that. Now, what if they go ABD or ABDEF? If they remove any one of the elements of our claim, they are technically no longer infringing our claim, and our patent wouldn't be valid to be enforced against them. Does that help?
Yeah.
Great. Yes, sir.
So I don't know if this could happen anytime soon, but let's say an AI actually did come up with something that was entirely on its own, that was patentable. Because it can't be patented, would that go into the public domain then?
That's a great question, right? No, not necessarily, because if there's a company, if it's proprietary AI and
It's not patented.
but it's entirely behind a firewall, that is certainly potentially amenable to trade secret. So trade secrets are not great for semiconductor hardware, because you can take that computer chip, chop it up, and see exactly all the dimensions, etc., that are in those structures. But the process for making those structures, process IP in the semiconductor industry, is often quite valuable, because as long as there is not a signature of the process you use that rings through into the market, say you've got a nanocrystalline composite, and it usually has a particular particle size range and morphology, shape to it, then and that's a signature that you're going to see in the end product, and that those material properties really only come from this process. There's another process to make the material, but it winds up looking slushy and weird. So when there's a signature from a process that you can identify in a product, that process can be valuable as a patent. If not, it's probably more valuable as a trade secret. As I mentioned, when a product, when you can buy a competitor's product in the market and just totally reverse engineer it, not a good scenario for trade secret. Any other questions? Any comments?
Yeah, I'll throw a comment
Sure.
down there. I think it'll be. Well, we're talking in this case about AI models doing a complete invention on their own and then submitting that to be patented. And I think we're probably still a ways off from that being a real thing that would happen often. But I think that there are probably going to be lots of inventions and patent applications that might be supported by AI tools. And a couple examples that jump to mind are work done by DeepMind over the last several years to, for instance, discover lots of new protein structures. And then, so I think that was in 2018 or 2019, they published some hundreds of thousands or millions of new proposed protein structures that were previously unknown to science. And
Cheers. Yep.
a protein structure by itself probably isn't a patentable invention.
No, it absolutely is.
It could be.
Yes. Yep.
But I assume that
If it's found in nature, that's a composition of matter would be the type of patent, utility composition of matter. But if it's found in nature, then you have the subject matter eligibility problems.
Yeah.
If it's a novel protein structure, new, unique, synthetic design, absolutely.
Yeah, I assume people would then study those and work them into usable drugs, and maybe that would be then eligible to be patented with a human contribution.
Yeah, potentially. The problem that I see for those is where it's very clear that the AI came up with a compound, chemical formula, and structure all on its own. We don't have that human contribution that we really need to get a patent on the valuable IP there, which is the composition of matter. Now, it may be possible to get a patent on a method of administration. We're going to give it to patients for such and such indication at such and such dose range. You kind of describe the therapeutic protocol.
That's
but
the kind of thing I was thinking of.
But then you're in the position of, do you really want to sue doctors who are providing therapy to patients? Of course, there are folks out there who will do that, but there are some that won't. And so it kind of depends on your ethical stance, et cetera. But it can be a bit of an optics challenge, depending on where you're trying to enforce within the value chain.
Yeah. Within the last year or so, DeepMind did the same thing for crystal structures. So they created a model that proposed 2 million new crystal
I did see that. Yeah.
That in theory, you should be able to synthesize them, and they should exist and be stable.
Yep. But we've never encountered before.
Yeah.
Totally de novo, brand new.
Unknown to science. that those should be those materials should have interesting properties, and we should be able to make some of them in products. I think that kind of thing will probably happen a lot, where there's things like material science or protein structure synthesis that could, in theory, have been done by subject matter experts in those fields, but
Absolutely.
it wasn't practical to
Absolutely.
do that for millions of compounds.
Real quick, Gary, I'll get right to you. There's some really interesting work at some of the SUNY campuses. I think it was Buffalo State. And there was a gent at Buffalo State who had developed an algorithm. They would take a protein and essentially just smash it into a bunch of different pieces, and then they would look at the pieces and they would do computational analysis to essentially come up with what the original conformation would be. So this was an interesting technique for various reasons. But yeah, it goes towards being able to develop new drug structures and things like that. Yeah, really interesting. Gary.
Yeah, just two things real quick. I think like when you think about AI, like for protein structures, the human element comes in actually creating the AI to actually figure out this protein structure. Because we're not Skynet yet.
Sure.
Right? Like AI is just not going around by itself. The other thing is it could probably be patented when you actually do the scientific verification that the protein works, because even though you have the protein folding, a lot of those proteins are useful, right? So you have
Part of the challenge currently is that these AI systems, neural networks, are a bit of a black box, right? We train them up on large reams of data, and we don't ultimately understand how and why they do what they do. And so there are definitely efforts underway towards building more modular, transparent, human intelligible neural networks and AI systems. And once we have those, it should be relatively easy to take a kind of functional component from one neural network system and plug and play with one from another. When it comes to the fact that they're relatively black box systems, what we wind up doing as the human side of that contribution is kind of defining the problem. And there are certain instances where defining the problem can be sufficiently inventive in itself, but it can also be a really challenging space. There was I'm going to try and remember the name of the case here. It's kind of evading me a little bit. There was a case on a diagnostic for not neonatals, post-birth, prenatal, and so what they wanted to do is be able to figure out genetic profiles on infants before they're born. Amniocentesis is the standard method. Since the late 80s and mid 90s, folks have been looking for different ways to just take a blood sample from a mother and determine whether there was any genetic conditions with the fetus. Ultimately, the guy who solved it did it by looking at tumors that shed fragment DNA, said, I wonder if the placenta does that. Yes, placenta sheds fetal fragment DNA, and what everyone was doing was they were taking a blood sample and they were throwing away the liquid portion, and they were keeping the cell fraction and doing analytics on that. What this guy did is he did the centrifuge, threw away the solid portion, the cell fraction, looked at the more in the blood, the fragment DNA that was left in the serum, and was able to, with pretty good accuracy, determine genetic conditions. Unfortunately, the way that one all went up through, was the invention really seemed to be in his definition of the problem. We're looking in the wrong place. We should look here, and it may have had somewhat to do with the phraseology in the claims, but sorry, long-winded. I get that way sometimes. It can be really challenging. Yes, sir.
I was just going to give you a heads up. We got 15 minutes
Okay.
for our scheduled time. I'm sure it's fine to keep the conversation going longer than that, but just for your
Thank you,
prepared
Patrick.
remarks, want to keep that up.
Appreciate it. We're really close. Any other questions in the IP patent space with this?
It was back when, before neural nets were hot and heavy, I read about this thing where they use genetic algorithms.
Yep.
To design an antenna.
Okay.
And I don't know if like not if something like that would be patentable. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Because you know numerical computations, whether it's genetic algorithms, neural nets, or whatever, have been used for other things like designing antennas. Would that be a patentable thing? Because we're not, or
Again, it's going to depend on the significance of the human contribution. How much did the human contribute? So, and everyone here is probably pretty familiar with genetic algorithms and their use. So I won't go into that unless. Sir?
I was just following up on the DeepMind idea. So, like, if you have this AI program that can come up with hundreds of thousands of protein structures, and then as a developer, you're like, well, I'm just going to iteratively list, these different forms for proteins or shapes that might be useful one day, so I can practically get patents. I can have all the patents, and then aggressively use them to kind of create a moat or like a monopoly of some sort. Is there any sort of like, how would that work?
No, that's a great question, a really interesting question. I mean, with COVID, we've heard a lot about the S shape on the spike protein.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if folks may be well aware, but COVID, that S shaped spike binds to our ACE2 receptors, and those are involved in respiratory and blood pressure, which is part of the reason that it has some of those effects. But there was some really interesting research out there looking at coming up with other materials that would essentially have kind of a similar shape that could effectively block up the ACE2 so that it couldn't act as a vector for the virus to enter the cell, because the virus would latch onto the ACE2 receptor and use that to insert into the cell. And so, yeah, shape, right, form and function is often very involved in biology. Yes? Sorry, the question is if they're seeing a lot of these things? Well, I would say at this point, they would probably then become suspicious that AI was involved in generating. And so if somebody had their home bake on their laptop and was able to come up with the next 2 million unknown protein crystalline structures, and they file that in a patent application, they're going to have to be cognizant that you only get one invention per patent. So there's nothing stopping you from describing 1,000 different inventions in a patent application, but you only get to claim one invention per patent. So with the patent, if you claim many, the patent office will give you a rejection. They'll say pick one for now, and then file a divisional or a continuation to go after the other inventions if you want to. And so when we're talking about thousands of structures, I get concerned as well that there's probably multiple inventions in there, and it would be more likely that they would focus in on probably a family of compounds that has a similar backbone or skeletal structure that they could get a lot, because protection on a single compound isn't any good unless it's the compound you're taking to market. And if you're going to spend $2 billion and 10 years to get it through FDA, you better be pretty sure that that one compound is going to be worth your effort. If you can protect a family of compounds as novel and non-obvious, that can be much more powerful. Let's see. So in terms of what we mentioned earlier as well, it's a bit of a fractured landscape when it comes to the regulation. So not any one agency, holds all the keys when it comes to different topical areas. We'll need to go to different agencies. And Federal Trade Commission is, I believe, also involved in some of these copyright disputes around this. if anyone wants to grab my LinkedIn or Vela, but I'll be sharing those with you anyway, so don't worry about it right now. These are the addenda on software and encryption export controls. And then I got a bunch of this stuff that's kind of fun. If folks want to talk about organoid intelligence at all, I think it's going to be a real slippery slope. That's going to, they're pushing for 3D. The dish brain stuff is cute, but we want 3D organoids, brainoids. This is a rat brain, visual cortex intentionally injured and stopped up with a human brainoid. And then when we really go in here, you can see that it's starting, the tissues are starting to kind of interlace and it's providing recovered function, etc. So. Yeah, rife with ethics, all sorts of good stuff. All sorts of different electrodes being developed. SUNY Albany did some neat stuff more than a decade ago now where they had to do some brain surgery anyway. They put in some high density microelectrode arrays and they got 80% accuracy thought to text. There's an AI system out there now that's doing a lot of predictive thought to text. There's some real interesting stuff going on. Implants that are going to restore lost vision, provide synthetic vision, and record organic vision. So who needs body cams? So, and this is primate. We can infect it with a virus, get it to talk with light, implant with the semiconductors here that address individual cells. It was really fun listening to these folks trash talk Neuralink because they're like, stimulating the brain with electricity. What are you doing? Like, we can do it with light, address a single cell. So this guy's up for possibly being the first cyborg, as is Johnny Ray, who was a Viet War era vet who was locked in. In '97, he got some of the first electrodes that allowed him to control a cursor on screen. And then the guy who did the surgery on Johnny Ray went down to the Caribbean with $30K in his hip pocket and paid some folks to put a bunch of fiber-coated electrodes in his head. He started having all kinds of synesthetic, weird. He was going crazy. They went back down. They said, well, they're in deep. We're just going to clip them at the surface of the brain and patch you back up, send you home. But when they disconnected him, at least he stopped having all the weird effects. So that, as a impassioned tech developer, he felt that it just wasn't moving fast enough. So anyhow, I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. And thanks very much. Happy to continue the conversation. Any questions? Any burning?
Just on the human input to a pet, do you know, has anyone patented just a prompt to AI?
So a prompt wouldn't. A prompt to me would seem to be very challenging to patent based on the criteria, and especially when it comes to software. Since 2014, there was a Supreme Court case, Alice v. CLS Bank, and it really upended the whole software patent prosecution practice. At the time, depending on the art unit, successful grant dropped to below 10% in some art units. The pendulum has kind of swung back and forth since then. It's been about a decade. I would say it took 5 years to really kind of find a bit of a medium. At this point, it's a little bit more certain, but you're always going to have challenges when it's pure software, data in, data out, because then the underlying data transformation must be sufficiently novel, unique, non-obvious. When you're working with systems that are physical cyberkinetic systems, when it's controlling a physical system of some sort, monitoring, controlling a physical system of some sort, even controlling virtual systems to some extent, providing input to a human for a human to make a decision, a little less that can be, but that's still more kind of the data to data and just giving it to the human. When the system actually controls when the AI controls a physical system itself, especially the more novel that physical system is, the better your chances to get it through. Yes.
So a lot of what regulations you were covering were instructions to the government for what they were going to do. On the purely commercial side, what regulation is coming down the pipe that may affect, I'm thinking things like the California Consumer Privacy Act or other things that may impact the people developing AI and ML applications today?
I think, let's see, where are we going to be? Oh, wrong search. I think it's probably going to be in these areas where the states are focused. So probably election protection, again, the algorithmic bias and discrimination in employment, I think are going to be some of the first areas where we probably see this. And in addition to, the reporting requirements to private companies on the AI hardware systems that they're developing. Gary?
Would some of those also be covered by other like the Americans for Disabilities Act if you're being discriminated?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that's one thing that a lot of these agencies keep reiterating is we have existing controls in place, and if just because you're using AI isn't going to get you a pass around these, you're still going to have to adhere to all the current controls.
I was just curious about, you said we have an agreement with Canada on ITAR, right?
What that was a Bureau of Industry and Standards export control on the geostationary AI, and that was a regional stability. And so that issuance meant that licenses are required for all countries other than Canada.
I'm just curious why Mexico was included because they're in NAFTA.
Fair.
Okay.
I don't know, probably along with the Five Eyes, exclusive club, etc. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that, actually. I was wondering if you see any similarities with the encryption export control debate or conflict in the 90s. I believe a case went to the Supreme Court over the freedom of speech aspect of that. So if someone prints the source code for a neural net that does geospatial stuff on a t-shirt for a small font and walks across the street over to Tijuana, how does that get sorted out?
Yeah, so the reason if I'm remembering correctly, there was a discrepancy under the old export control for encryption where if you took it outside the country on a disk format, you were going up the creek. But if you took it out in paper format, you were technically clear. And so you could take, reams and reams of pages of the source code and technically get it out without violating the export control. What I've seen so far on the AI side is really more directed towards the hardware. I'm curious how we will, really enforce that. We have challenges, especially when we're talking about patent infringing products that are coming into our country from foreign countries. We have trouble identifying those. And so this to me seems somewhat similar, but yeah, I'm sure we're going to have a better handle on this end of it, the export control, just because of all the interested parties. Gary.
Do you think the AI proliferation is going to turn into almost nuclear proliferation, in that regards to how things kind of happen internationally?
I think it's going to potentially be faster than nuclear proliferation because the barriers are maybe lower. It's a lot more difficult to get your hands on fissile uranium than it is, a high-end GPU. I feel like that sieve for the AI hardware will probably be a little bit more porous than export control around nuclear tech. And so I think it'll proliferate more rapidly, especially on the software end of it. The hardware end, right, is important in implementing those. And then when it comes to some of the organoid intelligence stuff, it was 4 years ago now, is Cortical Labs out of Sydney, Australia, and Monash University. They did that dish brain, and it learned to play Pong in under 5 minutes. And so a lot of folks are saying that these biohybrid neural networks, neuronal with semiconductor neural networks, are going to be the way that we'll get to AGI much more quickly than LLMs, et cetera.
Sorry, this is maybe a basic question, but what is covering like ChatGPT and the GPT models, or like, you know, all the advanced models, like what specifically in the law, besides them just hiding it, like from us, the code, what protects them, like protects their IP.
What protects their IP?
Yeah.
It's a good question. So Google very famously patented their very first search algorithm, and they've never done that again. They've never gone back to that well. So VC often really only understands patent, and if you try to explain to them why trade secrets are valuable, you know, they know patents give you monopoly. The government says it's good. And they can understand that. Trade secrets can be way more valuable, and that's why Google and everybody who's doing algorithm development will tend, if you can, it's nice because with trade secrets and patents, you can actually dovetail fairly well with software and software embedded systems, because you can get patents on the functionality, essentially the decision tree for the software, how it operates, that whole flowchart diagram. You can get a patent essentially on that for the software if that functionality is novel, and especially if it improves the operation of the system. And so on top of that, if the software, if that flowchart diagram is executing algorithms and, you know, proprietary math on the back end, then you want to keep that source code very well protected, firewalled, technological solutions to prevent your competitors. And that's going to give you way better protection than disclosing that kind of information in a patent application so that your competitors know exactly how you're doing what you're doing. Tell them what you're doing, but not how you're doing it, you know, to the greatest extent possible. So trade secrets and patents can be very valuable for...
What if it gets leaked? So what if their model gets leaked?
SOL. You can go after somebody who has misappropriated a trade secret. If they don't have deep pockets, that's not going to be very helpful. And once it's out there, and there's nothing you can do to put the genie back in the bottle. Which is why sometimes, you know, again, VC really likes patents, because it doesn't matter if somebody independently develops or reverse engineers, they know that the patent will apply. For a trade secret, if somebody reverse engineers the Coca-Cola recipe, you know, it no longer has that. Well, I don't think that's a really good example anyway, but we have we've got mass spectrometers, we can do that.
So you worked in various areas of technology and law for a long time, and then over the last month or so, you did a deep dive in AI regulation and policy for us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
But I was curious to know if you found anything in your deep dive here about AI surprising, or you found unusual relative to your experience in the past about how this is shaping up?
Let's see. Kind of this threshold here. I don't know. It seems very big, but it also seems a little arbitrary to me. We're getting close to ChatGPT-4 is like close to 2 trillion parameters or something like that, and so I feel like learning about the size, the extent of these models can be really enlightening, because, you know, to the point made earlier, you know, neural networks have been going along for a long time. Perceptrons and neurons, and we had the first self-driving vehicle in the 1970s. It was on a track. It was a bus to hold the computer, the whole mainframe, and it was on a track, and it went 2 miles an hour because the compute was so slow. So it was on a private track, but it was able to drive itself. It was really neat how you saw the lines on the side of the road kind of start to show up in the synaptic weights too, when you look at the array of the synaptic weights. Yes, sir.
Actually, related to this, I was hoping to get 3 more questions in. So first of all, I think this is a question for people who want to use these models. So if you use one of those models and it was trained by this amount of flops, and you continue training, do you have to report that? Or so that's really a question if you do this kind of fine-tuning what people do with these models. The other is who actually controls and how to keeps people responsible that they report this, and okay, how is this accounted? So for example, ChatGPT or GPT-4 consists of many different smaller models. Do you have to sum them together or one of those?
These are great questions.
My first statement is right now I think there's a lot of development going that actually reduces the amount of compute that you need to get to the same point.
So with neuromorphic, we're talking there about spiking neural networks, 3rd generation neural networks that compared to the large convolutional, deep neural networks can achieve similar results with 100 times fewer neurons. So 2 orders of magnitude fewer neurons and 1,000 times less power. And so that's a great point because we're coming up with alternative hardware structures now, as opposed to the GPUs, TPUs, et cetera, that are going to be even more efficient. When it comes to NVIDIA and the GPUs, they're great. They've been a huge boon for AI, but they're super power intensive and could
but even
derail our
NVIDIA graphic chip, I think the new techniques like LoRa or something like that, the low-rank adaptation, are reducing the amount of compute that you might need to get to the same point.
Yeah.
So it's as you said, it's an arbitrary number.
No, absolutely. That's a great point because here we're regulating on the hardware side, and we're saying to really crunch these models, it's got to be hardware like this. But when we figure out a different model architecture that's more efficient, et cetera, this lower level hardware is going to be just fine to run that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So that I think that's a good point. It is an arbitrary number, but so doesn't this go back to, at least on the code front, is it Bernstein versus the U.S. where
You've got me there.
Basically, the federal government had a limit on the number of bits you could use in its encryption algorithm, right? So that was thrown out because code is speech. So how are they going to enforce export controls on code? Has that changed?
I'd be really interested to follow up with you on that one and dig into that a little bit more. I'll just go back to the addenda on the software encryption because they do come up with some. Right, so these are ITAR munitions list. That's our the EAR here. Strong dual use encryption, what it is, what it isn't. Because you'd mentioned the number of bits, and I'm pretty sure I have that in here somewhere. Yes, right here. Yep. There it is. So, my understanding, this control is currently in place. So, if you are exporting an encryption, that exceeds these, integer factorization capabilities, you'd be subject.
Usually, I think that's a great software people that say things like you're great.
Yes, sir.
It's funny, you talk about patent infringement and whatnot. I mean, a patent is basically, if you can't enforce it, why spend the money? I mean, if IBM, you got a patent and you spent the $100,000 or whatever it is these days to get a patent, and IBM just starts using the patent. I mean, what are you gonna do? You're gonna sue IBM? I mean.
Have you ever seen that movie Flash of Genius?
Unfortunately not.
There's a great movie out there called Flash of Genius. It's a Greg Kinnear flick. He plays the guy who invented the variable speed wiper blade. Yeah, Flash of Genius. So he invents the variable speed wiper blade. He starts pitching it to Big Auto in Detroit. He takes it to Ford. Everyone tells him, "Oh, this is really super great. We'll be in touch." And then Ford just puts it into their cars. And so he's an engineer, an independent engineer. What's he going to do? And well, he fights him pro se. And I won't give you too many spoilers. But yeah, it's a really heartening flick because ultimately he does prevail, and he argues pro se the whole way, and so it takes a champion, but the little guy can ultimately protect himself. He's got to be willing to sacrifice a lot, though. But that's a great point. Everyone says, and it's very true, patents are only as good as your ability to enforce them. And so if you don't have the technical savvy to dig in and represent yourself pro se, and you don't have the financial ability to hire attorneys to do it for you, then it might be more of a vanity project. In academia, we see patents for that sake, all the time, just to be able to tell the story even. Oftentimes universities will have in-house folks who can do that, so that maybe defrays their costs a little bit, so they're not paying market rate necessarily. But patents are very expensive, and unless you will be able to enforce it, it might not be the best decision. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to hang out, and we might transition somewhere later to talk more about brainoids over a beer. If anyone's interested in that.